Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, givers, doers, and thinkers. Welcome to this Center for Civil Society webinar on Hollywood, America, and civil society, an hour-long discussion benefiting from the participation of two, I'm going to call them movie aficionados, both friends, who will explore whether Hollywood loves, hates, or is ignorant of, or even indifferent to, that special American essence, that integral part of our national character, civil society, as expressed by that famous non-American Alexis de Tocqueville. What prompts consideration of this topic is a dual reality, like our nation's seemingly exceptional proclivity to form voluntary associations, independent of government, to address needs, to broaden community, to create fellowship. Hollywood, too, has a preferential claim on American greatness, as our homegrown movie industry may rightly be held as the source of our nation's greatest cultural influence, both nationally and globally. From the Great Train Robbery to 80 for Brady, for some 120 years, Hollywood has played an outsized role in framing the American experiment and in shaping, whether consciously or not, the way Americans take to heart their role and obligations as citizens and members of its civil society. This thing of which Alexis de Tocqueville made so much of a philosophical ruckus, this unique process in which Americans seem to instinctively form voluntary associations to address issues and problems, to collectively pursue happiness, to make common cause of their friendship and aid and love of neighbor. This has been a subject of and a target of and the bones of just some cinematic classics. To me, just a few. Nevertheless, some version or portrayal of the implied spirit of civil society has also proved a backdrop or maybe a mood in certain important film directors' bodies of work. So what is our objective today? Well, there are three objectives. The first is to see what evidence there is concerning Hollywood's relationship with and understanding of and promulgation of American civil society as it has been traditionally understood. The second objective is to look at a few classic films and the work body of some directors to see if there is evidence of Hollywood's appreciation of civil society, that it is a real thing, a vibrant thing, an American thing, that maybe deserves recognition at the least, or adulation even at the most. And the third objective is to get an understanding from our aficionados as to how they see Hollywood portraying America. Of course, there cannot be a holistic understanding here, but it would be of great interest to understand from Ross and Kyle how they think certain movies, certain genres, and certain directors try to define or influence what it means to be America and Americans. So who is this Ross and who is this Kyle? And by the way, who am I? I'm Jack Fowler. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for Civil Society, which is an arm of what used to be called American Philanthropic and is now called AmPhil. I was the former publisher of National Review, and I was blessed to have working relationship with both of these fine men. And who are they? New York Times columnist Ross Douthat has been filing movie reviews for National Review magazine for nearly 2 decades. The former senior editor of The Atlantic is the author of several books, including The Deep Places, a memoir of illness and discovery, To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism, and The Decadent Society. Wall Street Journal film critic Kyle Smith has shared his silver screen assessments for just as long for the New York Post and National Review. Kyle is also the theater critic for the New Criterion, the former People magazine staffer and U.S. Army lieutenant. Is that correct? I didn't want to shortchange you, Kyle. You weren't a captain, were you?
Nope.
Lieutenant? Okay. Is the author of 2 acclaimed novels, Love Monkey and A Christmas Caroline. Love Monkey was a series for about a blip.
Yeah.
But more than anything that ever happened to me in that regard. So I'm going to ask this question of both. And by the way, I want to state up front, this may be a souffle as we talk about civil society in Hollywood. There may be, we may find that there's really no interest historically. We may find that there are some interesting shreds, but let me begin with the premise that there is a form of civil society that is exceptional to America, this being an inherent and natural desire to form voluntary associations, to initiate and address things that are too numerous to count: hospitals, schools, orphanages, sewing circles, state fairs, Little League, Bowling League, Knights of Columbus, Oddfellows, Elks, Moose, the League of Women Voters. The kind of collective social activity not found in its intensity in other countries or other people. Let's extend this premise to say that civil society is critical to understanding America and its development. And in fact, civil society is definitional of America. That's my premise. You may disagree with me, gentlemen. We seek here to understand how Hollywood deals with America's civil society, like the way the screen can deal with America's politics, or America's military, or gangsters, or heroes, or sins, or it's all kinds of subjects. So to my friends, I'm going to shut up now. I'm going to do all the participants, and thank you for joining us today, folks who have signed in. You want to hear from Kyle and Ross. So I want now to pose this a couple of questions to them. I'll ask this of Ross first. How would you characterize Hollywood's treatment of civil society? Does it recognize it? Does it disdain it? Is it unmindful? Is it indifferent? Is it evident? Is there anything there? Is there any there?
I think first, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be back with Kyle. We used to do a, much lamented by the 117 people who listened to it, movie podcast of blessed memory.
Yes.
So it's great to be here with you again, Kyle. Thanks so much, Jack, for having us. I think there's certainly some there. I guess I'll offer sort of three very broad examples of what I see as sort of cinematic engagement with civil society, and then maybe we can sort of fill in some of the details as we go. The first is that Hollywood has always been very interested, probably more so in the 1940s and 50s than today, but I think the interest persists today in the sort of foundations of American civil society. This is one of the big themes of, above all, the most Hollywood American of genres, the Western, right? Where time and time again, you have stories that are sort of happening in this liminal zone in between sort of the Wild West, the landscape of, the gunslinger, where there's neither real politics, or there's only the most basic form of politics, and there certainly isn't any kind of civil society, and the establishment of civilization. You could sort of, the most archetypal examples would range from The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance to, movies like The Searchers or Shane, where you have sort of figures of the Old West who end up not having a place in the emergent society. And you could go back and forth about whether that's about sort of political founding or civil society founding, but I think it's a little bit of both. I think the Western is very interested in the transition to civilization, including civil society in that transition. The second example would be the sort of the romance of the small town, right? The movie that is about someone getting out of, the atomized, hyper-competitive city and finding, true love and community, almost always community, in either a return to their hometown or an accidental arrival in their home, in somebody else's hometown. I think the examples of this are legion, but a couple from the last 4 decades would include, say, Groundhog Day, right? Which is, a sort of a complex movie, but a movie about, a jaded urban weatherman who gets trapped in a Tocquevillian nightmare where everybody knows everybody else and has to sort of gradually transform himself into someone who can fit in a Tocquevillian society, if you will. A less famous movie, it would be like Baby Boom with Diane Keaton, about a hard-charging career woman who acquires a baby and ends up living in a small town in Vermont and starting a baby food empire while falling in love with the local vet. Doc Hollywood, where Michael J. Fox ends up sort of sidetracked into a small town, Sweet Home Alabama. None of these are, Groundhog Day is a classic. The others I'm listing are not exactly classics, but they're a genre, a typology, I think, that extends certainly unto, if we're including TV movies, the entire Hallmark
I was going
cinematic
to say, you're
universe.
defining the Hallmark Channel. Yeah.
Right. The Hallmark Channel has distilled this into an incredibly repetitive formula. But I think it is important in that formula to see that the people are always, it's not just they're not just rom-coms, they're not just romantic comedies. People are falling in love in the context of some, Gilmore Girls type small town community. And then the final example is something that we're familiar with from literature too, which is the sort of subversive look at the evils of communitarianism, the suffocating small town, which the sort of the babbitry, the philistinism, the cruelty of small town life, which again is maybe more, I don't know if it's more powerful in American literature than in American cinema, but you certainly have many examples. Just to pick one from 25 years ago or so, a movie like Pleasantville, where a couple of kids are sort of nostalgic for the world of a kind of father knows best type small town. They're transported back into that time, and they end up sort of liberating and liberalizing it, ushering in the sexual revolution and freeing everybody from the suffocating puritanism of a black and white small town. So those would be, I think, three sort of big picture examples of different ways Hollywood has engaged with this question over the years.
Kyle, before you answer, I do want to say I hope we will talk more about the Western as a genre, because I think there are some complexities in there about the sense of community versus the heroes, the bad heroes in some of these movies, Shane, and they're individuals. So there's some tension there. It would be interesting to explore that a little more. I do also want to let our viewers know that if they'd like to ask questions themselves, on the bottom of the Zoom screen, there's a Q&A function. You can click on it and write your question. I will, if we have time, and I very much want to pose your questions to Kyle and Ross, we will do that. So, Kyle, any thoughts on that broad theme of civil society, or any reflection on anything that Ross just offered?
Well, I thought Ross's take was brilliant, as always. To the extent your thesis starting out was, well, maybe your thesis was Hollywood doesn't really care about civil society. Why don't they care? I would offer a couple of points. One, there's certain aspects that they're very harsh on. Hollywood traditionally is very harsh on the corporation, which I think a lot of us would find a lot of sort of teamwork and togetherness and bonds and friendship and things around the office. Hollywood generally has been very negative on the corporation. They've been very negative on the suburbs also, to the extent we've seen that in movies like American Beauty and Revolutionary Road. The suburbs are kind of smothering people's ambitions, and their true natures are not allowed to come out. But there are a couple of enduring examples where Hollywood keeps going to this again and again, and I think that's because as human beings, we always long to be part of some sort of collective or another. And I think we can see this in the military movie and the sports movie, right? These are Top Gun Maverick, biggest movie last year. The military is very much a team. They're all helping each other. We all have a common enemy. It's sort of blandly patriotic. We don't really know who the enemy is, but maybe it's Iran, maybe it's Russia. Who knows? The point is, diverse Americans are all working together on this project, and that's always what the sports movies are about, right? I just saw one last week called Champions, which is a new Bobby Farrelly movie in which Woody Harrelson plays a down on his luck basketball coach who gets assigned, he gets caught with a DUI. So as part of his rehab, he gets assigned to coach a Special Olympics team. So a team of mentally challenged young adults, they have Down syndrome stuff, various mental challenges, disorders, and they all come together and they get together and they compete in the Special Olympics, and they all kind of bond. And this is, the basic formula of every sports movie, right? You get, we see the same thing in Ted Lasso, people from various backgrounds, they all come together. But a main reason we don't see as much sort of pro civil society movies as we probably like is because there isn't enough conflict there, right? I mean, if you come from a happy family and you work at a happy corporation, that's not a movie, that's more like a sitcom. So a lot of this gets relegated to, as Ross noted, in his idyllic Connecticut town, which I'm sure is the place where he lives, and Gilmore Girls, where everybody's part of this unit and everybody's nice and everybody kind of talks the same language and they all speak fluent quip, and everyone wears nice Banana Republic clothes, and it's great. But that wouldn't be a movie because it's just too nice. It's not really movies tend to take us to the extremes of human behavior. And I personally would rather see a 70s movie that's full of conflict and gray areas and dark undertones than let's say a rah-rah patriotic 40s movie.
Okay. I do want to let you know that where Ross lives, Benedict Arnold, I think, was the mayor of that town once upon a time, just for a historical note.
The greatest general in the American Revolution, Jack. What do you have against it?
Because, well, I'm waiting for the movie. We'll see what it says. Well, let's look at one particular movie, and then maybe we can talk about a famous director, or if you would like to bring up a movie or a director yourself, please feel free. But a movie that's a catch-all for, it seems, every situation. And in part, we want to talk about Americanism here, is Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And also I'd like to, since it's a Capra movie, It's a Wonderful Life is also a film that's often used as a mirror or an explanation for any number of situations, and it may or may not apply here with civil society. Interesting, in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, I think it's at its core, it's really talking about the kind of thing Tocqueville was writing about in Democracy in America. Here you have Jimmy Stewart, the character, and creating this youth organization, and they're trying to get some outdoorsy stuff going on. But of course, instead of just being dependent upon themselves and their friends and neighbors, they're asking the government for help, and they come collision with the government and corruption. So we all know the story. I assume everyone watching this has seen Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, although I shouldn't be shocked, as more and more in my life I talk to people who never even heard of Casablanca, and never mind have seen it. But Ross, let me start with you. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, not so much about civil society, of course, if you want, but how do you think it applies as something that helps or tries to, maybe overtly tries to define or give a sense of what it means to be an American, what it means to be in America? Did it try to do that? Does it do that? Does it still resonate 80 years later?
Well, I mean, I should say that while I have seen Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, it has been some time since I saw it. So viewers who have watched it recently will have to forgive me if I, misstate anything. But my impression of that movie is that it is, well, in certain ways, similarly to a lot of Capra movies, it's very in touch with sort of the dark side of American life and American politics. It's, it's remembered as this, it's sort of Jimmy Stewart, super idealism, sort of citizen legislator, all of these things, but it's a very, very sort of dark and corrupt, a portrait of a corrupt Washington, right? And of course it's being made at the time of the New Deal. Apologies for the movements behind me. It's a snow day here. At the time of the New Deal. So it's sort of, in certain ways, the heroic age of American liberalism, but has a very dark view of government that is sort of close, I think, to what you're suggesting, Jack, that sort of there is this kind of, this sort of, well, you could say it's a vision of what happens when the communitarian impulse has to get channeled through an incredibly powerful central government with all of the corruption that entails. So it's idealistic, obviously, in the sense that it presents sort of, the citizen legislator as someone who ultimately does vanquish, the the sort of the corruptions of DC. But as in It's a Wonderful Life, it's, Capra loves to push Jimmy Stewart to the brink, right? You're like, this guy, he's going to die during the filibuster, right? Just like in It's a Wonderful Life, he's going to commit suicide and so on. So it sort of goes, but both that movie and It's a Wonderful Life go all the way to the edge of a real skepticism about the American promise before pulling back. And in Mr. Smith, it's more about the promise of politics, I think, whereas It's a Wonderful Life is a communitarian movie. Fundamentally, it's about sort of saving the virtues, the sort of saving virtues of being an important man in your community and being content with that. But they're both movies that are darker than they're often remembered, I would say.
Kyle, you agree with that? And if you have, I'm sure you've seen It's a Wonderful Life. I may not have seen it recently, but I'm betting you have seen it.
For the record, I've seen It's a Wonderful Life recently because I see it every Christmas.
Yeah. Kyle, any thoughts on It's a Wonderful Life or Capra?
Those are basically the first two crowdfunding movies, right? So in Mr. Smith, we've got the people are good, but there's some overarching institution that's evil and is going to put their hammer down on you. So to me, that's kind of a sentimental view that the big bad institution is out there and it's threatening you and it's always going to crush the little guy. But that's been a very resonant theory or theme throughout Hollywood history. What I love about It's a Wonderful Life is very important, and then it shows how banks work, right? The building loan is in effect a bank, and there's that wonderful scene where Jimmy Stewart explains, you can't all take your money out at the same time because that's not how a bank works. We only have a tiny percentage of our reserves in cash here. Your money's in your neighbor's house, and that's a very wonderful kind of pushback to the traditional view of banks is evil and they're just making money off you, and all interest is usury, which I think is a very typical, very shallow view that Hollywood has. But these are important institutions that are part of what made America great. Borrowing capital, supplying capital. This is how the country was built, and this is a very vital part of civil society is the banking industry. And there's just hardly anything good to be said about banking in the entire history of Hollywood.
Well, I do have a related question I'm going to ask that's been offered up, but I do want to say in that movie, the scene of the run on the bank and the run on the savings and loan, and the guy that demands his $252.27, and he gets it. But Jimmy Stewart's goodwill to him, regardless of that, is remarkable. But he wins over the crowd. I think it's a beautiful. That whole scene is beautifully done. We have a question from Kent Lassman, the great Kent Lassman, and Kent asks. He says here, Kyle discussed how American film treats business. Can Ross and Kyle discuss the role of the innovator and entrepreneur, subverting the status quo or otherwise inventing the future?
I think I lost you, Jack. No.
You have me?
I've got you now. Yep.
Can you repeat that last thing about entrepreneurship?
Well, again, Ken's question is about the role of the entrepreneur and the entrepreneur and the innovator in film. Kyle, you kind of sideways touched on that a little bit, talking about the banking industry. Do you have any thoughts you want to say? Any answer to this question?
Well, I feel like very often in a movie like The Founder, which is about Ray Kroc.
I was just thinking of that movie.
Yeah, Michael Keaton plays a guy who actually did play a pretty important role in American business, but the movie's really more about how he's an alcoholic and how he's kind of mean, how he's kind of ruthless, and there's really not very much respect given to how much he built. So we either get that on one side, or on the other side we get a movie like Tucker, Man His Dream, where any kind of individual who bucks the system gets slowly crushed by the system. I think there's very few movies where there's like a total appreciation for people who build things. Even the Steve Jobs movie, I think, was kind of cool to Steve Jobs. It was respectful. It wasn't gratuitous. but it definitely was interested in sort of the hard edges rather than what he built, which was $1 trillion company.
What about there is a movie, and I can't remember the car manufacturer who built the car with the one headlight in the middle, and then he was forced out by GM, and oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's Tucker. That's Tucker, A Man in His Dream, right?
Oh, that is that. Oh, okay.
That isn't that? I haven't. That's one I haven't seen in a long time. But so
okay, all right.
But so I mean, I agree with Kyle. I think that quite often you end up having movies, you know, where characters end up as sort of stripped out of the context of the movie, or sort of the movie is read differently by the audience than it's intended by the filmmaker, and that's where you get a certain kind of, if you're looking for sort of, you know, not businessmen or entrepreneur characters who are treated sympathetically by the movie, but businessmen or entrepreneur characters who the audience responds to, you'll often find it in that way. With sort of the ultimate examples being like, you know, Michael Douglas on Wall Street, right? His Gordon Gekko is obviously, you know, the villain of the movie, and yet, you know, becomes sort of an inspiration for Wall Street, for a certain kind, let's say, of Wall Street trader. Or even, I mean, I thought The Founder was a really interesting movie, because it sort of, I think if you watch that movie carefully, even though it is sort of, you know, depicting the founder of McDonald's as this sort of, you know, cutthroat, soulless guy who in the end sort of steals the original idea from the original founders, you also can see in that movie very clearly like why without him McDonald's would have never taken off, right? That he does have a specific kind of genius that the other people he's working with don't have. But it is sort of exceptional. There was this movie that nobody really liked with Jennifer Lawrence called Joy. What did you think of, like, 7 years ago, that was about?
Yeah, I like that movie. I liked it.
Yeah, so that's a movie that sort of sprang to mind as a movie. I sort of, you know, I don't think David O. Russell, who made it, is a big fan of American capitalism, but it has a sort of feminist angle. It's sort of a housewife. That's I think often where you get the pro-capitalism or the sort of entrepreneurial message. If it's someone sort of who's an underdog from Hollywood's perspective in some other way, like even Baby Boom, which I mentioned before, It's sort of against the soulless capitalism of the boardroom that the Diane Keaton character is in at first, but then she starts what is basically the equivalent of like you know, whatever the big organic baby food company is, and it's that is sort of straightforwardly celebrated. So you can have that, as long as it's not, you know, an evil white man or something doing it.
Well, there is Tommy Boy, which is always a great business movie, and I'll recommend. I don't know that either of you gentlemen have seen it, but there is Executive Suite, I think is the name of the movie, from the mid-50s, that really was in depth and focused on business in the boardroom, and not everyone's a villain in it. It's quite an interesting movie. I'd like to just say one last thing about civil society, and then we can talk more about Hollywood and its perception of America, its patriotism, its anti-Americanism, whatever. You know, I leave the nuances to you, but there was one movie that I thought was really dead center on civil society, old movie Boys Town with Spencer Tracy. And here you have a problem, young boys, homeless, a Catholic priest, dealing with getting other people involved in this project and creating this project and saving these boys and creating community and not relying on the government. So I think it was kind of one-stop shopping for a movie that gets it completely. I would nominate Boys Town. So I don't know that either of you have seen it or even seen it recently, but I heartily recommend it. Spencer Tracy did win an Oscar for it. After all. So my friends, let's turn our attention to get your thoughts on Hollywood and how it casts and portrays America. simple, well, I don't know, a simple question, but here's the question. What are some films and some directors that you believe have done an excellent job of giving an honest portrayal of what it means to be an American and what this country itself means? And that's not a loaded question to say. If you say, yeah, Oliver Stone fits that definition, and he might, just has a different view. This is not a conservative podcast here. This is not a conservative webinar. But anyway, what are there certain films or certain directors, particularly the directors who try to make a point of focusing on America and what it means? Kyle, do you want to take that?
Well, you mentioned John Ford, and Russ was right in that these movies about the West are sort of about how we're trying to tame the frontier one step at a time. And there's always kind of a contrast between sort of what you might call the outdoor scenes and the indoor scenes. And the indoor scenes are, there's romances and there's dances and there's a wedding scene in The Searchers, and as you pointed out, which nobody seems to remember. And very often Maureen O'Hara is in the mix there, and the women are kind of the civilizing influence, and they're the reason we are kind of moving forward rather than just kind of killing each other on the battlefield. And I think the most underrated John Ford movie is Rio Grande, because there's this great family dynamic there, and there's a historical dynamic too, because John Wayne burned down Maureen O'Hara's house in the Civil War. She was a Virginia plantation owner, so there's some bad blood, there's some tension there. And also his son shows up. John Wayne's I think a colonel, and the son shows up from West Point. He washed out of West Point, and he's in a way sort of failed. The family has not worked, so they're trying to replace the family with this military unit, which is in a sense the kind of family on the prairie. And I think that movie has a lot more kind of emotional valence than the other two cavalry movies. I know everyone likes She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, in which there's a kind of love triangle, and it's kind of played for laughs between these two guys and this one woman. It's all a bit comical, and John Wayne's sort of the friendly superior who's trying to keep everyone straight. But to me, Rio Grande goes a lot deeper, and the presence of Maureen O'Hara always makes the movie much richer, I think, when she's around. There's a tendency in John Ford movies to go very broad. You've got these two kind of big lunks in the background all the time, Ward Bond and Victor McLaglen, and they're always kind of falling down, having goofy fights. Maureen O'Hara really brings the heart to that movie.
Yeah, that's it's the least watched of the trilogy of Fort Apache and She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, but it's a terrific film. And I forget the name of the young actor who was the boy in The Yearling. He was, and he is the son of John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara in them, and his horsemanship is incredible, as is Ben Johnson. Anyway, great film. Ross, any thoughts that you might have, particular director?
Well, they're all, I mean, it's all about America, right? At some level, it's very hard for Hollywood not to make movies about America. Even when we're making movies about foreign cultures and countries, we almost always have to have an American abroad, or an American, you think of like Tom Cruise in The Last Samurai, right? This is a movie allegedly about 19th century Japan, but it stars Tom Cruise as the American in Japan. So there's a sort of inescapable Americanness to Hollywood that persists, I think, even in the age of globalization. It's very hard to watch any Marvel movie, even as much as this is a point of great disagreement between Kyle and I, but I'm fervently anti-superhero and anti-Marvel. But you have to acknowledge, even as they become sort of multicultural and they're in Wakanda and they're in space, these are still incredibly American movies that you can't imagine emerging out of any other culture. Since Kyle mentioned loving his sort of cynical 1970s movies, I'll speak up for those and say that the sort of revisionist movies, the movies of sort of the disillusionment and paranoia that come out of that era are themselves really effective engagements with and wrestlings with America. There's a reason that The Godfather endures, and it begins with a monologue about the immigrant experience in America, and then sort of is we could talk for hours about what The Godfather says about America or doesn't say, but whatever it is, it's clearly one of the most American movies possible, as are similar movies about the immigrant experience, similar movies that are sort of revisionist of classic genres like the Western that we've been talking about. Unforgiven is as much a movie about America as She Wore a Yellow Ribbon. So I'm sort of rambling a bit. I guess I was sort of trying to think of movies that capture sort of American tapestries, which so much of America. My family and I drove across the country last summer, and my God, it's a big country, right? Like just the fundamental sprawl of the United States. It's sort of incredible diversity and complexity is just sort of essential. And I was trying to think of movies, sort of what Robert Altman tried to do in the 70s, some of the interconnected stories of like Paul Thomas Anderson and Magnolia. I don't love those movies. I'm not a huge Magnolia fan. I enjoy some Altman movies, but I don't rewatch them. But I sort of appreciate the attempt, that style of cinema of like, how are you going to capture the whole beast, right? Yeah. And trying to sort of weave all these different stories together. I think that's a very American style of filmmaking in its own way too.
Can we talk about the superhero movie? Kyle, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to throw out a wild card, which is that you could say that the films of Wes Anderson are about civil society, right? There's usually his movies are very much family affairs. He uses the same actors again and again. And the movies themselves, within the movie, it's basically a team of oddballs coming together for some oddball right to be oddballs together, like The French Dispatch, for instance, which is set at a crazy magazine in Paris. And then there's crazy people on both sides. There's crazy writers and there's crazy subjects of the writing. And everybody's sort of working on this joint project, which is everybody wants to be an individual together, right? And they need this institution, which enables them all to be kind of free spirits, much as you might have a traveling troupe of actors that are both together and individual at the same time. And that's one kind of backdoor way of getting at civil society without, being cliche about it, I guess.
Well, we're here to talk about movies, and I have to make a commercial announcement after this. But if either of you have you seen Deadwood?
No, not really. I watched
the TV show.
Yeah.
Yes. All right.
Norm, a good old friend Norm here posts something. Says Deadwood is an incredible movie, even though it's on TV, about people trying to build a civil society and the pushback from so many folks. The heroes are, in the sense, what have been called stationary bandits. Anyway, any thoughts quickly on Deadwood? I have not seen it. I'm sure many have.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, I think it is a sort of dark and gritty example of that kind of Western as founding narrative idea that I was talking about earlier. I mean, it's very HBO. It's very sort of, blood and sex and cynicism and all the rest. But Deadwood itself, it sort of matches what Kyle was saying about Wes Anderson movies, right? It's a motley crew of people coming together, except instead of having sort of slightly off-kilter adventures, they murder each other over claims and so on. But yeah, I completely agree. I think that's an example of Hollywood is really interested in the moment of sort of formation of civil society, the kind of, the moral compromises required to get it going, the figures who fit in at that moment but don't fit in thereafter.
John Wayne and the Searchers and Shane.
Yeah, all of that is there in Ian Swearingen and all of the Deadwood cast, definitely.
Well, let me just make first of all, I just want to, this is not over. We have about 20 minutes left. John Hanna, my colleague who runs the Center for Civil Society, he and Caitlin O'Sara who are my colleague who helps put this together. I want to thank them for making this webinar possible. And coming up, if you go to American Amphil, that's our name, Amphil's website, amphil.com/events, you'll find some upcoming events that you may want to participate in or attend. We have a Scotch talk on major gifts on March 14th. You can bring Scotch if you want or not. And then we have another webinar that John Hanna is hosting on March 29th. It's on the charitable tax deduction, very worthwhile. I'm sure people who are particularly givers might be interested in that. And later in the year, November will be here before you know it. November 7th and 8th in Scottsdale, the Center for Civil Society is having its Givers, Doers, and Thinkers Conference on the rise of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, how declining religious affiliation is changing civil society. You'll find out all those things at amphil.com/events. And we talked before, you gentlemen mentioned your little disagreement on the superhero genre. I saw Superman in 1978, and I think that's about it. Maybe I saw a Spider-Man movie. I've not seen any of the Marvel X-Men. I just haven't. It's an empty zone. I have a feeling I don't want to see them. I have a feeling they'll offend me for some reason. I probably shouldn't feel that way. But in the context of discussing America, let me ask two questions. Like, what do you think this genre gets America, portrays America honestly, or is there an effort more so to try and use this genre to, I don't know, redefine America? That question may be not applicable in any way, but try to answer it if there is any kernel in there, and then just explain briefly why, Kyle, you like the genre, and Ross, why the Marvel movies don't seem to float your boat.
Well, he's being slightly mischievous there. I don't like the genre overall. Most of them are kind of boring. And lately, in particular, the last couple of years, ever since Avengers Endgame marked kind of at the end of the era there, I find myself writing the same review over and over again. There's empty spectacle. There's a lot of quipping. Everybody is, way too unfazed by the attack of the aliens or whatever. Everything comes way too easily. There's too much green screen crap. The movies increasingly look terrible, especially when you look at Avatar: The Way of Water. That is genuinely a spectacle. That is genuinely a beautiful movie. It may be stupid, but it's genuinely beautiful to look at. Whereas that last Ant-Man movie just looks terrible. There's this sort of this Humpty Dumpty figure, this kind of gold Humpty Dumpty figure that's supposed to be funny, and it's just stupid instead. But within the genre of superhero movies, I think we've seen you can do various things that are interesting. Like the first Ant-Man movie brought back the 60s kind of heist movie, which is a fun kind of subgenre that we had with like Cary Grant and stuff like that. And Peter Ustinov would be in this movie. So
Copy. Yeah.
There's no reason you can't make an interesting movie within the superhero genre. You could do it interestingly, but increasingly they're not. And that Black Adam movie was another example of just a ridiculous spectacle. And the very unfortunate thing about these movies is they kind of get away from interesting human conflict and more toward, well, what if I could shoot lasers at my fingertips and the other guys could throw, giant boulders at me? Which one of us would win? They're just essentially juvenile questions that animates these movies. And to the extent there's dialogue, there's just these kind of quippy one-liners. There's a lot of failures in this genre, but it doesn't have to be a failure. Joker was an interesting movie, for instance.
Ross?
Yeah, I mean, I was overdoing it in imputing superhero love to Kyle. And I agree with him that there's sort of even within my exhaustion with the genre, it's become more exhausted in the last couple of years. I think if you go back to the characters that even you as a conscientious objector, Jack, are sort of familiar with, Superman above all, but the others as well, they're just sort of they're the archetypes of sort of mid-century America. You have, a lot of people involved in writing superhero comics at the start were immigrants. You have, Superman is sort of the ultimate, the ultimate immigrant from another planet who becomes the champion of truth, justice, and the American way.
Really
And
Jewish.
and that and then you have sort of Bruce Wayne's Batman as sort of the more 1970s figure, even though there's obviously a sort of happy-go-lucky, goofy iteration of Batman, but sort of the vigilante and sort of a cowboy figure. It's sort of the opposite of the sort of Deadwood Western dynamic, where it's like about the beginning of civil society. The Batman movies are sort of always about the end of civil society and the vigilante trying to restore order to a decayed environment. But yeah, I mean, I don't think Marvel or any of these genres are, in fact, that subversive of Americanness at this point. They've emptied out some of the patriotic distinctives that you used to get more of with Superman. They have become more globalist, if you will, but in a way that's sort of weightless and bland in certain ways. And they're still coming out of this sense of, well, I mean, I'll finish by saying, you were asking before about, who are the entrepreneurial characters, where is the lionization? Well, both Iron Man and Batman, right, are not actually superheroes. They're ordinary guys who happen to be really good at inventing. They're ordinary industrialists like you and me, right? Who happen to be really good at inventing things and inventing weapons and armored suits and all the rest of it. But they are, in certain ways, can do American Edisons who sort of redeem the businessman class by beating up bad guys. So you have that element in play, certainly, in the superhero genre.
I'd like to we have about 10, 12 minutes left, and I'd like to see if we have a little time at the end to talk about very current stuff with Hollywood's reaction to acceptance of or parts of the 1619 versus 1776 fight, and how it's, in my limited knowledge, seems to have seeped into the Oscars, or what movies will be considered based on certain percentages or quotas of representation, cultural representation in production of movies. But that aside, I'd like first to talk about another genre, and that's the film noir, which is maybe it's Frank Capra just unleashed. I don't know. They're so dark, but to me it seems very, very American. I don't know how steeped either of you are in the film noir as a genre, but what you know of it, is there anything you'd like to say about what film noir says about America? How does it reflect America? Ross, you want to?
I mean, I would say noir is this sort of, it's not the subversive movie where it's saying, oh, community exists and it's suffocating and terrible. It's sort of the nightmare where America isn't, there's no community in America. We're just atomized individuals wandering, the streets of the naked city, ready to be seduced and betrayed, and the cops are corrupt, and, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think, if you wanted to be philosophical about it, you would say that, the United States as a communitarian society is always vulnerable to the breakdown of community, and noir as a genre is about that, basically.
Okay. Kyle, any thoughts?
I think the reason noirs age so well is because they are so cynical, and they imply that we have guilt and we're fallen angels. A movie like Double Indemnity, you've got the very, very charming Fred McMurray, who's also very loathsome, and equally troubling Barbara Stanwyck on the other side. I think none of these movies are really big hits when they came out, the noir movies. I think they were probably seen as artsy, kind of low budget offerings. Sometimes they won Oscars, but I don't think they drew huge audiences. But these are some of the most enduring movies of the 40s, right? The Lady from Shanghai, I think it's a brilliant movie. I don't think it made any money whatsoever. Touch of Evil, notoriously a big flop for Orson Welles. Postman Always Rings Twice, I think might have been kind of successful. But these weren't like the defining movies of the era because they were kind of too dark for 30s, 40s America, where you had people were much more interested in seeing heroic and lovable figures, whereas they kind of presaged the 70s movies where we had the age of anti-heroes, the age of moral pollution and compromise, and that's why they endure so well, I think.
Well, let's conclude with your, unless I get any more questions, with your thoughts on these, I'll call it the 1619 cultural battle, which has attending cultural aspects to it, the rise of Black Lives Matter, the consequences of George Floyd death, but these things have seemed have percolated, continue to roil even. And so it shouldn't be any surprise that Hollywood reacts to this in some way, absorbs it in some way. I believe it has. Do you believe it has? Do you believe Hollywood is in some, I talk about Hollywood like it's, just one massive brain sitting there thinking, but in the collective, has Hollywood tried to appease the 1619 project, so to say? And I don't mean specifically across the New York Times piece, but in general, has Hollywood tried to appease this? And if so, is it trying to redefine the roots of what it means to be in America, what America means?
Well, I haven't seen the miniseries on Hulu, but I think definitely there's a lot more openings in Hollywood for Black directors, Black writers, stories about Black life. The problem I think they keep running into is kind of there's a fear of being insensitive, a fear of being offensive. I think we saw that in the latest Black Panther movie, where the characters were so idealized, the Black characters were so idealized that they were kind of flat and uninteresting, and it would have been a better movie if there had been more of like the Killmonger villain from the first movie. Was a very interesting, complicated character. Is played by Michael B. Jordan, and he had a legitimate grievance, and he was a very interesting villain. But the second movie, you got like Angela Bassett, and everyone's kind of mournful, and everyone's kind of angelic, and it erred too much on the side of not offending anyone. You're better off if you put complexity first, rather than sensitivity toward possibly being offensive to the audience.
Yeah, I spent a little time recently for a piece for the Times trying to think about, what is there in Hollywood right now that you would characterize as explicitly woke as opposed to just liberal, right? You always assume, okay, like Kyle was saying, Hollywood's going to make a lot of movies that are hostile to business. And if they make a movie about the Old West, the Native Americans are going to be lionized at the expense of the white settlers. But that's Dances with Wolves, right? Like these are not novelties. And in terms of sort of what movies are made now, this may change in the next year or so, but if you look at even the list of Best Picture nominees, the two best movies out of that list are Tar, which is an ambiguous, ambivalent movie, but certainly can be read as a critique of wokeness in part. It's other things as well. And Top Gun Maverick, which is a huge hit that is, not right wing, but certainly rah patriotic, not sort of like, oh, America's, a fallen place founded on evil. So it's not clear to me that there's been a kind of general woke revolution. The one place I do see this real change kick in, starting in the mid 2010s, are kids movies and Disney movies especially, and not in the sense that like they're lecturing you exactly about racial justice or something, but there is a real change where romance goes away. There's hardly any princess romances in Disney movies now. Villains become impersonal. you lose the sort of, you know, the Scars, the Ursulas, and you get sort of these literally like miasmic forces or misunderstood forces. And there's a kind of almost therapeutic dynamic where, like, you know, Encanto, which is a movie with great songs, written by Lin-Manuel Miranda, you know, the songs are great, but the movie, like, if you sketch the plot, it's basically, you know, sort of family therapy for 2 hours, which is very strange for a Disney movie. And I think that change does have to do with wokeness, not in a sort of literal, like, we're indoctrinating our kids with, you know, whatever theories about American history, but in the sense of, like, you know, we got to move beyond these patriarchal models of storytelling and move beyond the cliches of the prince and the princess. And what you end up with is some very sort of strange stuff, but that is sort of consistent movie to movie. There's this consistent absence of villains, consistent absence of romance. And that is a change, but it's not as sort of explicit as it's not propaganda. It's just a thematic change shaped by politics in some way.
Well, in the 2.5 minutes we have left, I really like dispense with Americaism, patriotism, civil society, and just ask the both of you, is there a particular director whose works you just really respect, whether it's a current director or historic? And the old question, like, what's your favorite movie? You know, you had to pick one. What movie do you really enjoy? Have you really enjoyed watching? Kyle, we'll start with you.
Oh, I have many directors I enjoy over the years. I think Steven Spielberg's great. I think Martin Scorsese is great. I have a theory that Scorsese's films basically add up to one big cosmic comedy, this kind of very black comedy about how everything works. And how you shouldn't believe any kind of authority figures, and something pleasing about that to me. I think my favorite movie of the past year was The Banshees of Inisherin, which I guess Ross didn't like as much as I did, but I think it made kind of the Irish, shall we say, penchant for quarreling into something kind of grand and comic and dark at the same time, and it had much to say about our current quarrels and how petty everything is, and yet how potentially toxic everything is.
Kyle, if you you were very busy and you saw The Godfather on television, you're flicking the channels, would you stop whatever you were doing to watch The Godfather?
Well, I don't flip channels because I don't have cable anymore, but yeah, I would do that if I still had cable. Yes, it's great. I actually haven't seen part 2 enough times. I've only seen it like 3 times. I've probably seen the first one 12 times.
I won't tell you about Fredo. Hey, Ross, director you really, or directors you really, really like, and yeah, your go-to movie, your favorite movie, and your Godfather.
I mean, I think the conventional, you know, the conventional list is correct. I agree with everyone that Kyle named. To pick a recent one, because they do seem to have stopped working together, at least for now. So I would say the Coen brothers. I think in the last like 25 years of film, their overall oeuvre, sorry, I said oeuvre, but it holds up really well. It's an incredibly impressive range of movies. And I too would stop. And the movie I'll offer you too, the movie that I champion as a genuine classic, as opposed to just a popcorn movie, is Jaws. I think Jaws is the best movie Steven Spielberg. It's the only perfect movie that Steven Spielberg has ever made. He's made movies with higher highs, but it is, I think, a perfect motion picture. And then out of the Coen brothers' work, this is not their best movie, but since we're talking about America and sort of interesting pro-American movies, I think more people should see Hail Caesar, which is their recent movie about Hollywood in the 40s and 50s and the studio system. It's also their Catholic movie. They have, you know, A Serious Man is their Jewish movie, and maybe True Grit is their Protestant movie, and Hail Caesar is their Catholic movie. And that's a sort of mysterious observation, but if you watch the movie, I think it will make sense. And it's anti-communist, so there you go.
All right, like it. Well, folks who are viewing this webinar, thanks for joining us. And if you want to read the brilliance on a regular basis of Ross Douthat's observations of cinema, you would find that in National Review. If you want to find his brilliance on everything else in the world, you'll find that in the New York Times. Kyle Smith's brilliant. He's the film critic of the Wall Street Journal. I mean, that's pretty high stepping,
Yes,
Kyle.
yes.
And he's also, he goes to the theater. Kyle, how many plays are you seeing in a month?
Oh, not that maybe 5 or so. It's very busy this spring, though. It'll probably be like 6 or 7 in the next few months.
Okay, well, that's at the New Criterion, which is a small magazine, but it's filled with great writers like Kyle Smith. Kyle, my friend, thank you so much for joining us today. Ross, my friend, thank you so much. You guys are terrific. I appreciate all the wisdom you shared. Folks, please join us. Check again, amphil.com/events, and you'll find the forthcoming webinars and conferences we'll be having. And thank you very much. Appreciate your attending. God bless all. Bye-bye.